Welcome back. In this video, we will be discussing specific examples of the persuasive appeal of ethos, which is one of the three persuasive appeals we covered previously. So to recap quickly, we understand that there are three broad categories of persuasive appeals or persuasive strategies that we will work with when analyzing the rhetoric of a text. The first of these is ethos. The second is pathos. And the third is logos. Ethos refers to appeals to credibility. Pathos refers to appeals to emotion. And logos refers to appeals to logic. Typically, in any given text, one will usually see combinations of these different appeals. We discussed that pathos tends to be the most commonly used, logos tends to be the least commonly used, and ethos is somewhere in the middle, right? There will typically be appeals to both ethos and pathos in a text. Logos is rarer to see, but nonetheless still manifests itself. Now, these three appeals take on different forms depending on the text or context in which they're being used. So we've talked about different forms that rhetoric might take. So when someone is trying to convince an audience, he or she will use different media to do so. We know that a common method for persuasion could be a speech. We know another could be an essay. And we also know that things like commercials and advertisements are effective ways of persuading an audience. So what we will do in this video is we will break down some of the ways that we may see ethos appear in these different media. So we'll look at how ethos might appear in a speech. We'll look at how ethos might appear in an essay, and we'll also look at how ethos might appear in a commercial. So I'm going to create a simple chart to document these different examples. We'll start with speech. We'll have essay here in the middle. And then we'll have commercial here on the side. Okay, so let's think about how ethos, which again are appeals to credibility, would manifest in a speech. As always, we need to keep in mind what a speech is. So it is a verbal, verbal communication, essentially, that typically is long form and is structured. So speeches have the introduction, body, and conclusion that we've talked about before, right? We can think of them as spoken essays. Speeches, by their very nature and by the nature of the interaction of public speaking with the audience, they cannot be excessively long, because if they are excessively long, they will lose the audience's attention. So speeches tend to be shorter and more succinct compared to essays, which tend to be longer and more detailed. Now, any speaker is going to need to have some reason for speaking to a large audience. So a teacher in a classroom, he or she is the teacher, he or she has demonstrated enough competence to meet the minimum standard of getting hired at the very least. He or she may or may not be certified according to a state or province board of teaching requirements. He or she should demonstrate also content knowledge, right? He or she should be an expert in the subject. And so these are the credentials that a teacher has when discussing content to his or her students. In another case, maybe a university or college invites a speaker to a graduating class's graduation ceremony, and this speaker delivers the keynote address or a commencement speech. This speaker would obviously be invited based on some kind of credential or some sort of connection to the university. So there always is some kind of reason why the person speaking is speaking, right? Why is it that particular person? What insight or what particular wisdom does that person have to share? And so something that will be addressed or could be addressed is credentials. So a speaker will refer to his or her credentials when delivering a speech to an audience. Now, this can be tricky, right? Because a speaker does not want to go too far in relying on his or her credentials to build credibility, because this can seem arrogant. If, for example, I have a PhD in philosophy and I deliver a lesson to students, if I am continually, constantly referring to my PhD, I'm going to come across as smug, I'm going to come across as superior, and I'm going to come across as arrogant. And so this is a surefire way of alienating my audience and getting my students to actually not respect me, right? In fact, they'll look at me as being insecure and as somebody who is not comfortable in my own skin. I have to constantly be referring to my credentials. So this is a strategy that can be used. Sometimes it can be effective if it's used sparingly, but what we don't want, or what a speaker doesn't want, is to appear smug or superior to his or her audience, because that is a surefire way of destroying the connection between the audience. So how does a speaker create a connection with the audience? How does he or she convince the audience to trust in his or her qualifications? So an effective way of doing this is to downplay one's status. And so a speaker may have certain credentials, may be more educated than the audience, may be more accomplished than the audience, but the speaker will be careful not to make it seem as though he or she is better than the audience. And so typically a speaker will downplay his or her qualifications in order to appear more common to the audience, in order to create a relationship with them, a connection. If the audience feels that they can relate or empathize with the speaker, then there will usually be a stronger connection and more of an investment on their part. Another strategy that is similar to this is what we call the use of anecdotes. So the speaker will typically use a short story or short personal experience to, again, forge this connection with the audience. So a speaker might begin the speech by talking about an experience he or she had, by using descriptive details and imagery, and yes, some emotional appeals too, so that pathos gets rolled into this. The audience becomes invested in the story of the speaker. The audience learns something about the speaker. The audience feels that they know him or her slightly better, and therefore trust him or her more. So anecdotes can be a very effective way of getting an audience to invest early and quickly in a speaker. So these are common strategies related to ethos that one sees in a speech. Let's think about an essay. So like we said before, an essay tends to be longer and more detailed. So whereas the speech is delivered in, let's say, a 10-minute time or slightly longer to a large audience in real time, an essay is usually read and it's at the audience's own pace. So if I am reading an essay, I don't have to read the essay within a certain amount of time. I can dictate how long I read it and how many sittings and to what intensity. And so therefore essays tend to be longer and they tend to be much more detailed because the reader can take his or her time when reading them. Some of the strategies here are similar. So a writer will definitely want to not necessarily state his or her credentials, but will definitely want to demonstrate those credentials via some kind of knowledge of content. So it's very critical that a writer demonstrates content knowledge. This is a good way to build trust. And this can goes hand in hand with credentials. So by the writer revealing his or her content knowledge, the audience trusts the writer to know what he or she's talking about, and therefore trusts the message, the information itself. In addition to this, it's something that more commonly seen in essay would be citations. So by citations, we mean that the writer will use information and data from other sources, external sources, and then integrate them into his or her essay and then give credit. So for example, if a writer is writing a report about The effectiveness of some kind of diet. He or she will typically look at medical research, at a nutritional advice from licensed nutritionists, and then say, okay, this information backs up the point that I'm making about the benefits of this diet. Therefore, you should believe in the diet. So the writer is therefore augmenting and increasing his or her own credibility by using, or rather borrowing, integrating the information and credibility of other writers. And so you can think of it as kind of a percentage bar. So maybe the writer, based on his or her own expertise and qualifications, comes to the gate with a certain amount of a certain percentage rather of credibility. And by integrating other pieces of evidence from other writers, he or she builds his or her credibility in the eyes of the reader. And another strategy that's typical are the use of allusions. And so allusions are basically just references. It's a fancy word for references. There are different types of allusions. We will cover these in a future video, but typically a writer will make allusions to pop culture. He or she will make allusions to a reader's common knowledge. He or she will make allusions to his history. He or she will make allusions to common mythologies, such as the Bible, or such as other common beliefs that a reader will be familiar with. And so by doing this, the writer is demonstrating to the reader that he or she is part of the same tribe, so to speak, part of the same community. He or she knows and recognizes the reference points that the reader cares about and recognizes as well. And therefore, there is a connection between the two, even if they have never met before. So by using allusions, the writer demonstrates to the audience, I know who you are, I know what you know, I know what you care about, and therefore you can trust me. I am a credible source of information. Finally, let's think about a commercial, which is by its nature a more visual medium compared to a speech and or an essay. So a typical way that a commercial will build trust in its credibility is by using recognizable faces. So we typically see celebrities and actors used in commercials. Think of a car commercial. The car by itself does not necessarily make a persuasive point, right? But a celebrity that people recognize, a celebrity that people maybe admire, a celebrity that people respect is driving the vehicle, and therefore the vehicle suddenly becomes more desirable just by virtue of being associated with this celebrity or actor. And so that's typically an easy way for companies to boost their credibility, is that they bring in these recognizable, admired actors, and then therefore their product becomes more desirable as a result. We tend to also see emphasis on brand. So in addition to celebrities and actors, we see recognition of certain brands that are emphasized greatly. So brands can have trust, or rather can have credibility based on longevity. So a brand, let's think of a certain fashion brand or an automobile brand. So we have Gucci, we have Louis Vuitton, we have Ford, we have Honda, Toyota. So these brands have longevity. They have been around for a long time. They are recognizable. And so just by virtue of being around for a long time, the audience recognizes them and says, well, I know what this is. I know the reputation, therefore I'm going to trust the information that I am receiving from this commercial. Again, all of that information could be false, it could be misleading, it could be fallacious, but because it is packaged, right, wrapped up in a certain way by the use of these particular strategies, it comes across as more marketable, more digestible. So here we have a survey of various strategies used to appeal to ethos. So again, these are appeals to credibility. All of these can be used to certain extents in all three of these different forms of persuasion, these different forms of text. There are, of course, other strategies that are used by writers and speakers to build their credibility in the eyes of the audience. But these are very common strategies that one can expect to see. So if I were writing a rhetorical analysis and I wanted to focus on how the writer or speaker uses ethos, then I would want to be thinking about the form and audience expectations. I would then want to consider, based on those things, what are the strategies that the writer speaker will use that have the best chance of convincing the audience based on the message, based on the medium, based on what the audience wants. So in the next video, we will look at pathos, and we will again look at how pathos can be used in various types of texts in order to understand how emotional appeals are used. So I hope that you gain some clarity about ethos, and I hope you will join me as we look at pathos and then logos afterwards.